strategy, technology, artificial intelligence, digital ecosystem. Today, I have the great pleasure and honor to welcome Mr. Demetris Skourides, the Chief Scientist for Research, Innovation and Technology of the Republic of Cyprus. My name is Dr. Marios Efthymiopoulos. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Strategy International. And this is Prime Analysis. Dear Mr. Skourides, dear Demetris, thank you very much for coming at another web episode of Prime Analysis.
Thank you for having me.
It is a great pleasure and honor to have you here for a multiplicity of reasons, and I hope we're going to have a great deal and time between us to discuss a variety of issues, which I'm sure that we will need quite many hours to explain. As you know, Strategy International as a think tank aims to teach and showcase, if you want, the capabilities from Cyprus into the world of people like you, considering technology, considering the digital ecosystem, considering the challenges and the ecosystem that is changing vastly. So it is common also at Prime Analysis to start with the life of the person that comes into being who he is or who she is in this day and time. So please tell us a few things about Demetris, the young student who envisioned his future considering, among others, technology.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very diverse question, and actually a question that opens up many paths and memories. Let me start by saying that while I attended high school and eventually the Lyceum, I was always baffled about how technology could actually enable people to move forward. See, I had a passion beyond mathematics, physics, chemistry, all of that existed in the scientific, let's say, section that I followed. I was a very keen student on history, and after reading about things like the French Revolution, etc., I stumbled across something that was very, very inspiring. And that inspiration, for example, Anna Love, created for me the inspiration to understand what essentially could language or mathematical languages do to change the world. And following up on history to see, for example, ladies like Anna Love that actually eventually went on to create what we call the programming language Ada, eventually inspired me to actually think about how could people in the early 1800s start having a mathematical orientation that eventually became the everyday basis for what we call computing today. And that inspired me to pursue and study what we call computer science.
Is it, I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you, but is it normal for you now to consider that this is a mathematical world that we live at?
That's a very good question. I think as we speak right now, we're not in a world where we actually necessarily should split something being completely mathematical or physical or engineering. What we're seeing, for example, the technology has disrupted healthcare, and we call it health tech, just like we see technology disrupting what we call, the government and the way the public sector works, and we see solutions called GovTech or FinTech. We actually see that mathematics, physics, all of the other disciplines come together, and they're actually enabled by something underneath that I would call, that mathematical, let's say, semantic type of understanding. So yes, I think that today, most of the areas and most of the things that we will be preparing for in the future, either we call it data science or data-driven analytics or artificial intelligence, etc., require very strong, background from mathematics and eventually, those other type of capabilities that I described earlier on.
So tell us more about your life. So you've discovered history, but you discover also natural sciences. You discovered the ability of let's say, multidimensional understanding and thinking that mathematics and geometry and more provides. where does the first step of studies starts with?
So the first part of my journey started in Arizona State, where I actually pursued computer science, graduating from the College of Engineering in computer science with an emphasis in software engineering. Eventually, that led me to actually refocus after finishing university in the area of security, information security, cyber security, etc. Eventually, onboarding into a mission where I started thinking about the international standards and how this could actually bring more value for the world. Being part of the organizations basically that drafted the standardized bodies of ISO 27001, which is the information security management system, or ISO, for example, BS 15000, which is the service management, etc., to eventually being part at some time of the initial team that was actually looking at what we call lawful interception, which was the discussion about where do we actually start, and how do we start processing that piece of information that a legal agency authority requires to see in case of an intervention that is required. Eventually, in 2006, I had a transition, went over from the R&D side, or from the standards development side, into the commercial world, pursuing my love for technology, my passion for building technology, given that my core trade was actually programming, software engineering. I followed on, with a giant called Oracle. And I spent approximately 16 and a half years in the journey with Oracle through different roles, having a very different set of experiences until before I left Oracle, I actually served as the, let's say, the cloud go-to-market lead for all of ECMEA and Asia Pacific, which under that, I had the responsibility of developing the ecosystem in terms of adopting the Oracle technologies. B, the responsibility of leading the engineering teams that were actually working with, ISVs, what we call independent software vendors, that are essentially the teams that are developing the solutions that we today, buy as ready-made solutions. And C, basically the people who are actually, creating the collateral for enablement, for adoption for the entire engine. And that was a very beautiful experience, because it enabled me as a professional coming from an island called Cyprus, to really operate across a scale of 100+ countries, very different time zones, very different mentalities of, how do you operate, how do you actually, drive things with teamwork, because you have what, the follow the sun model is, customer finishes, for example, at 5 o'clock, and the support is actually working on the other side. And eventually that transitions for me. I had the opportunity to move over into what I call, for example, AWS as the industry strategist, who wanted to build onto my experience of building solutions for industries, particularly because at Oracle, one of the biggest successes that I had created was a framework and a unit called the Partner Cloud Center of Excellence, which was a unit that brought together a value-added distributor and the resources from the corporation, where together we built what was required for the company to scale, providing one-stop shop services to the companies and the ISVs. So that eventually was the fuel that actually enticed AWS. At AWS, I spent less than 7 months in the industry strategy unit with the commercial team of the GSIs, until I had a discussion with the president's office about taking up the role of the chief scientist basically for research, innovation, and technology. And the difference is that on one side the role entails the traditional role of a chief scientist, but on the other side we come with the innovation and the technology, which is more like the role of the CTO of the government. Hence the two together.
You mentioned a great deal of things, which I really want to go into it. But since we're starting from Cyprus, and I know that the geopolitical field is something that really brings a lot of questions into being, considering the challenges, existing wars, splitting of technology, R&D becomes much more mature, and at the same time much more competent, and at the same time much more value added for those that are seeking, if you want, the westernized world that is more collective, more combined. How do you see and envision considering your experiences in the market, I will say, you said Oracle, you say AWS. How do you see the market in terms of the digital ecosystem? So let's start from that part. What is the digital ecosystem for you, and how do you envision the role of Cyprus within the European Union, let's say, within the digital ecosystem?
Okay. So this is a very expansive question, but let's start from the basics. When in a corporation, when we talk about the ecosystem, right, we refer to different elements that may include, companies like a system integrator, an independent software vendor, customers, consulting houses, etc. When you actually start talking about a digital innovation ecosystem, you talk about, a lot more. You talk about, those companies that are, in one side they're vendors, on the other side they're providers. Samsung, right? Samsung is a vendor, but at the same time they're a supplier, right? And at the same time they're also a solution provider. The same thing you would see, for example, for companies like AWS, who on one side have the traditional Amazon business, and on the other side they are what we call the traditional cloud hyperscaler. Now the beauty of digital ecosystems is that these ecosystems are not the traditional way, the models that we've been used to looking at, how we do business. So it's not like you have a supplier who buys a product and then you have, a distributor and it moves on. When you move into this new digital ecosystem in the future, what we're essentially seeing is that you're talking about multi-sided platform business models, right? Where you have marketplaces of, users, suppliers, producers, consumers using all of these technologies. So take this a step forward. What we are seeing right now, where the world is going, is we're eventually getting very close to having an ecosystem where a user will be able to experience everything as a service, right? So let me simplify this in a few words, just for us to be able to see how this thing works, right? At some point of time, people used to buy let's say a solution that might be, or a device called a printer, right? And then you have a different inkjets coming in, or cartridges of ink. So you have support for the specific device. Then you have the service. Then you have the additional items. Then we moved into having things called product plus service.
Right.
Then we moved into having products as a service. So we don't care about what car we're going to use. We're going to for example, rent a car, and we have it, for example, in terms of leasing. And eventually we go up to the scale where we have the ultimate experience, where you want to order something for food. You have something called Foodie, right? Or Uber Eats, where you don't care about who provides it to you. You just have an application, and that application gives you that superior experience. That's called experience as a service. And eventually what we will be seeing is something called outcome as a service. We don't care about, who will clean the room. We don't care about, how many hours it takes.
So you're talking about not facility management, but rather management of the facility of the digital.
Exactly. Or the experience, right?
The experience, user experience.
The user experience. So we simplify it in a way that it's going to be so simplified, right? You just have everything, button, right, and that experience. Now, that is one axis where we look at it as a vertical axis. On the same time, right, we have a horizontal axis, which is becoming a lot more prevalent because of all of these automation technologies, right? So we're now talking about, automation in cars, we're talking about automation in factories, but this automation isn't just in these industries, right? For example, Oracle has a technology called the autonomous database. Right? At some point of time where we were down here, right, where we had the product plus the service, somebody had to maintain the database, patch the database, secure the database, right? Now, the technology is in it, right? You buy the thing, it's self-performing, self-tuning, self-securing moving forward. The same thing with your Apple Watch or your Apple Mobile. You don't actually have to worry about downloading an upgrade
it comes automatically.
You just click it automatically, right?
So it's a cycle. It's a digital cycle.
It's a digital cycle.
That you actually become part of that cycle, and everything does it for you automatically.
You become a part of the cycle, and you experience the convenience that it gives to you, and you move forward. Now, as I talked about, the experience on this side and the automation on this side, as we move up into this area here, we're talking about solutions as a service or industry as a service. smart industry, smart factory, right? Smart nation. You've seen, for example, what happens to Dubai. Now, you take that a level up, right? And you will also see, I give you an example of the the Atlantic Council that I've actually attended very recently, where we had a discussion about software, software-defined warfare, where essentially what people are looking at is, will the future be having infrastructure or device that can actually be upgraded with the capabilities in real time? Translate this into simple language. You actually deploy something that actually works today with this way. You have a counter opponent on the other side who studies and understands the patterns, recreates a different way of basically interacting with you. By pressing an upgrade, you basically adjust the entire performance or the entire, let's say, response to the system. So what I'm saying is, as we start bringing together the intersection of automation, right, with experience, we're creating new experiences, and these new experiences are different digital ecosystems. It could be digital twins for healthcare, it could be digital twins for cities, it could be virtual human twins, it could be Elber. So where are we in Cyprus? Well, Cyprus is definitely advancing very, very fast. In our research and innovation ecosystem, we have 12 universities, we have 7 centers of excellence, of which some of these centers of excellence are already very capable in terms of using technologies like artificial intelligence, and are already, working at, advanced proof of concepts with digital twins. Give you an example. We have Chios by the University of Cyprus, who is very specialized in what we call critical infrastructure technologies. So they build solutions that essentially, right, they can actually have the entire management, operation, oversight, and intervention of any critical infrastructure that is required. Likewise, we do that for health. For example, Biobank is using, advanced technologies both on the data science side, big data, and also AI to be able to really, look into the studies that they're having. We have science, which is looking at virtual twins and augmented reality in the human-centered experience. So we are progressing very fast from the R&D perspective and the companies that are really embracing technology. But, right, we need to take the next step on the journey, meaning the leap into the journey, where we start understanding that a digital ecosystem isn't a standalone center. It's not a standalone, system
You
integrator.
said it earlier.
It's bringing
it's
everything.
the whole ecosystem in your life, in your everyday life.
It's bringing together and connecting all of these in a way that they can have a seamless interaction that can really facilitate our lives.
Can I challenge a bit this strategic thinking, which is absolutely marvelous? I would like to ask you the following, and I'll try to make it very simple, as simple as it can be, also for our viewers. From a country that is at analogic level, that goes now fast paced, as you said correctly, to the R&D of AI. We're missing one thing. We're missing the fact of demographic change. Indeed, yes, younger generation is more keen and more keen into technology. There's also middle-aged people, and there's also people which are from a different generation, where even still a mobile phone never existed during their youth. How do you bridge that gap? How do you convince them? Because Europe is an aging population, unfortunately, that innovation actually, as you correctly put, should be embedded in our everyday life. We should embrace technology, not because someone said it who's a keen or specialist into technological affairs, because it facilitates our life and secures our life. How can we embed this, considering that while we're exposing technology to commercial elements and opportunities, research, or even market commercialization of product, we're also afraid of technology, because technology, as you correctly put, you studied about it, creates challenges such as cyber attacks, threats on personal data information, and so on and so forth. How do you put Cyprus into that path in a total scale, not political scale, in a policy level scale, let's say, so the government can inherit and can apply? What is the time scale, if there is a time scale, or is it synchronous, automatic level? And how do you actually embrace this, maybe at a European level? Because The Europe is the only union today of 27 member states that has recently adopted the AI strategy on Europe. It has done this pioneering level, but the rest of the world may not be so sure that they are keen to understand how AI works, or the World Wide Web, how it works by itself. What's your intake on all of those things?
Well, thank you for. I think this is there's a few questions that interrelate to others. So let me first of all start by saying that I myself, growing up in Cyprus, I finished the military at 20 years, and I didn't have a mobile phone. I started realizing
Neither did I, by the way.
I started realizing what a mobile phone was, right? I mean, in the early 2000s when I was in the US, and I started seeing that type of flexibility. And I still recall myself when I arrived in the US and I got lost while walking around, and I walked up to a booth and I called, and I found a taxi sign, and I called them and I said, I need a taxi to get home, but I don't know where I am. And they told me, we do know where you are. I said, okay.
GPS located on the phone
GPS
booth.
located on the phone booth, right? So for me, that was an initial culture shock, because I could not have imagined back then, that people would know where I am, and So I think we start first of all from the level of awareness, and basically really understanding where we are, how advanced are our systems. How advanced are the services that are being used, by, I think, the older generation or the third generation and the elders. And I'll say that, Cyprus, when I've spent maybe the first 12 months of my new role while in office to actually take the time to visit out, and I've seen more than 850 companies within the first 12 months. I realized that our adoption rate compared to Europe and to the rest of the world is not lagging behind by a very big gap, right? And what I say this is that
Is it because of the proximity of probably companies that are gathered together in one place? Maybe?
It's not the proximity. It's more of a factor that Cyprus has a legacy after gaining its independence, and after
as a service provider,
a service provider, right? Cyprus attracted, let's say, tier one type of corporations,
right.
an Oracle, a Microsoft, an IBM,
and software
an NCR,
engineering
software engineering, and the generation of systems that actually started being installed, in the public sector to serve the customer post 90s were actually very advanced for their time, compared to some other areas of the world. And the processes built, right, carried us with a legacy that we see until today that more or less served a big part of the public sector. Now, the next phase comes as we now are rapidly, I would say, influenced by a tremendous amount of dynamic change. I mean, we see mobiles, we see cloud, we see sensors everywhere, in fridges, in air conditions, right? The amount of sensory data coming in from all different sides is so big, but at the same time, right, we started realizing that we do need to actually protect the data much more, mainly because we've seen what happens with cloud hyperscalers or companies where you use your email, right, and essentially they do have some access to the data, and that creates a necessary tension between how much data can I share with whom, right, how much is available, and how you move it forward. And that creates the first set of problems that we need to really start understanding here, like Cypriots, because on one side, we want to protect our data, but at the other side, we're also an aging population. We have many elders, right? And
that is also in Europe, by the way. I just said it in order to be clear. We're at minus for the average European.
So going back to that position that you just raised before, imagine that, right? I mean, I have, for example, my mother-in-law is elderly and she needs some help. So we have, some helpers that are helping us, but the helper is part of the family, and when they actually see a receipt or a pay bill, etc., they can just take a picture of it, and on that picture you have your name, you have your address, you have 70% of the identification. So identification fraud is a major issue. So going back, and I'm starting to say that technology has introduced three fundamental challenges for us. Challenge number one is, how do you use it so that you can make your life easier? Challenge number two is, how do you actually secure yourself so you prevent yourself, right, from fraud? And the third thing is how do you also understand the sequences or the consequences of the social implications of people around that are really watching you at a much faster, a much more transparent pace? For example, right, I've got 1,000 friends on Facebook. If I post tomorrow, a check-in at a counter, for example, saying that I'm actually sipping my coffee in some airport lounge, right? They're going to know that I'm not home. That exposes me right to another. So what
Not
we
only that, because of your location of your phone, if you haven't turned it on.
exactly. So when you look at where do we want to take people, right? Where do we want to take the citizens? It's obvious, right? Without modernizing and embarking on what we call the next wave of digital solutions are going to be provide what we call the digital citizen of tomorrow, right? We're not going to be able to really sustaining giving a citizen an end-to-end service type capability and we're going to have them be always frustrated because they're going to be going to one ministry, one group of companies, etc. So moving towards a digital solution where citizens will actually be able to have these solutions within one environment, right? It's something that is the first step, and that for us as the government is what we call the egov.cy, which now has also the digital, let's say, assistant on it, etc. That basically starts making the services simplified. However, right, as we start getting used to technology, right?
We need to innovate further.
We need to innovate further, but we also have one other drawback that we also need to always consider. We start relying so much on the device that we start expecting things to be happening much faster, right? Much simpler, without us really have to moving around.
From the cell, from the infrastructure that gives you the cell, the signal, the internet connectivity, the protection of the digital footprint, and so on and so forth.
Sure. So you, for example, right? I mean, you sit home and you want to order something. It's a coffee coming in from Foodie or Uber Eats, or you want to order a taxi, right, or an Uber to take your child somewhere, or some family member, or you want to get something from Amazon. It's all happening within your mobile device. However, as you correctly said, right, the cell phone tower, the infrastructure, the data center, the electricity that is powering all of this, right, is a humongous type of beast that most people don't see behind. And it's like the iceberg philosophy, where you go, for example,
indeed.
right, to Antarctica, and you see an iceberg. You see the thing on top, but you don't see what's below, right?
Below.
And this
what we can see, what we cannot feel, we don't.
Exactly. And this part of what is underneath the sea, right, is exactly the hidden complexity that the government, that the private sector, that all of these people who are working with technology need to be able to harness and to actually, bring together and manage in a cost-efficient way. Now this, right, creates a whole set of challenges, because as Europe is defining, for example, reducing emissions, being more environmental friendly, it means that we need to plan for moving from A to Z. And while we're moving from A to Z, doing the normal type of business,
We have to meet the standards.
we also have to meet the standards.
Are they the DG standards? Are we talking about
SDG standards.
SDG standards.
Yeah, SDG is the Social Development Goal Standard. ESG basically are the energy sustainability standards. Now, building on this, right, you asked me a very important question: is how do you actually create a path for the citizen? So yes, we have citizens that are younger. We call them Gen Z today, right? They're much more advanced than what we were in our time, right? Some of them are more advanced
Our children are born with a gizmo on their hand.
Exactly. They're much more advanced than even what we're today, right? And now we have the elders, right, who slowly are in their phase out. So very recently, I did a very interesting experiment with my mom. My mom went from not knowing how to use a mobile to knowing how to use a mobile in 2 years, and now she's a fan. So she said one day, she came to me and she says, "Hey, is there any new trick I need to figure out?" I said, "So yes, I can introduce you to a good friend." She says, "What can the good friend do?"
Yeah.
The good friend can give you any recipe you need. She says, "Really?" Right? So she asked me, and I said, "Well, let me show you." So I showed her how she could use ChatGPT, right? And she wakes up in the morning, she says, "I want to cook this." And it gives her a new recipe. She says, "How about, doing this plus this? What would that give me?" And then the third day she came back and she says, "You know what? This one friend of mine has a friend who comes sometimes, and I think she talks Spanish, but I really don't understand what she's saying.
Later,
Can you actually help me communicate with them much more efficiently?" I said, "Mom, that's very easy. You just you just tell ChatGPT that translate for an elder, right, this conversation in Spanish from Greek, and that will do for you. Then you just give the message, and it actually translates. And that created a very good learning environment or cycle for my mom. Now, what I think we should be doing is we should be understanding that there's different types of people. There's people who have never seen technology. They don't know what a mobile device is, and those will not do the leap that easy.
They're becoming less and less, obviously.
Right. However, right,
they're still there.
That could actually be approached with the Dubai model. So what Dubai did is that they really invested in creating one channel, which is called the digital channel. However, they retained the physical center, which they actually called the center, for example, for water. If you can't fulfill or you can't finish a process online on your own, and you actually go to their experience centers, there's people there that are, customer rep offices or officers who will actually help you go through the specific process. And by doing that, they're teaching you. You're learning by teaching. And they've created a hybrid model where, yes, we have created this full digital model where we're showing people how to get there. But at the same time, until we get people over the bridge, we're going to maintain this slowly before we phase it out. So I think that's a strategy.
Such a thing in Europe?
In Europe. Well, we have something like that. We call it here in Cyprus. It's not in that phase yet, but it's called KIP.
The citizen office.
The citizen office.
That's why I was asking you, because are you now telling us that maybe the citizen's office should go high tech? Not the old high tech in the sense of 2025 and beyond.
No, what I'm saying is that our citizen offices here actually have managed to take away a lot of the complexity coming in from the
idea
from the industry, right? Yeah. To be able to serve in a one-stop office, right? Most of the needs of the citizens,
right.
Modernizing the infrastructure and the solutions that are there, right, will actually enable the one-stop office, right, or the citizen service to be able to offer a better customer experience. It's going to be able to offer it's more user-friendly, faster time, right, turnaround time. However, right, we want to do this in a phase approach because we're not ready to make that big leap. We don't have data centers in Cyprus.
No.
We don't have.
That's why I was thinking the prior, as you said,
right?
the beneath.
The beneath, right? So
are we there yet?
No, we're not there yet. We do have independent data centers. We have CETA. We have plans on modernizing and building a green AI data center, etc. Right? But going to a fully digital, 100% requires efficiency at scale. That's where we don't have this efficiency at scale. The cost of electricity is still not at that level where you can call it marginal for you to be able to make this right transition. So for us,
unless if they do it on a circular basis where it's a self-sustained center.
Even if you actually did that, you actually have two more things to actually take into consideration. It's not just about technology. It's about people. It's about the process. So the process, the legislation actually needs to be modernized or readjusted in some areas to be able to facilitate this change. But at the same time, you have to actually take also the people with you on a journey. So it's time that, we have to balance this in a way that we're not pushing the system too fast. You push the system too fast,
it bounce back.
It won't bounce back. It's going to have holes where cybersecurity is going to expose you. Cyber threats are going to be coming from everywhere. Data is going to be going out there, right? And we're not going to be able to really protect the digital environment of our citizens.
But doesn't this come on a straight counter process with regards to the fact that time is our worst enemy? Because the whole world is proceeding fast. You're talking about evaluation, you're talking about capabilities, you're talking about capacity. Don't you think that time, which is against us, we may not be ready at a time synchronization that the requirement of everybody else is? For example, I think that the innovation that the EU did, for example, in adopting AI as a policy, strategic policy, what is the AI, how do we use it, and so on and so forth, maybe one of the few innovations that Europe did, because the rest of the world does not have such a specific strategy or regulated strategy as it should have been, like the EU did. So this innovation by itself, yes, the regulation on AI, for example, does help, but in reality, it does not help in the global market. And the global market actually works without borders. The World Wide Web is borderless. And although we try to regulate this, they've done this attempt in France for many decades. They've done it through the social media. They've done it through everything else. The regulation, yes, must be protective towards, let's say, the European citizen or even the European resident within the EU. But maybe outside the world processes quite fast, quite faster than the EU. So how do you process this? Considering that, correctly put, you have to have quality versus quantity, because the world gives quantity, doesn't give necessarily quality. But on the other hand, you need to build on something that, as you said, data centers, logistics centers, you have to have autonomy on energy, and so on and so forth. How do you process this, and how do you bring a balance vis-a-vis a synchronization process that really needs to take care of? Because on the one hand, we need to offer our technology, our research within the European framework, and at the same time, we need to compete with the rest of the world. You saw what the UAE is going to invest 1.4 trillion over the next decade to the US. The US does not work with such regulations. It is of no coincidence that President Trump came out and said, we do not regulate anything. We need to process things as they are, and we need to push on technology. So how do you counter them, knowing that they're the first builders, like the Chinese, for example, if you want to balance things, and we're stuck in the middle as Europeans? So how do you innovate? And I think it's more strategic in value rather than the process itself.
So first of all, I'm going to go back to the actual problem. The actual problem is: do you plan for efficiency? Do you plan for effectiveness? Do you plan for impact? So at Cyprus, we're not going to stay behind, because we're already modernizing very fast our digital services, our next generation services. We do actually have a very good user interface and an experience. And just to give you an example, my dad is 75, and he actually wanted to go through, an application that he had to go into the car, go into his office, go for example to Co-op, which basically is the organization for agricultural processing, and submit an application. He did that online in 2 minutes, right? So we're already at a phase where we're helping save citizens a lot of the time for them doing that process. Now, obviously, with technology, just like with a car, just like with a house, every time you make an investment, there is a very big and hidden cost that comes in with the surrounding,
of course,
elements that we call the ecosystem.
That's why it's an investment.
It's what you call, for example, iPhone and Apple. You buy an iPhone, the next thing you're going to consider is the iPad. Then you're going to need
the market,
right? So that's the challenge with what we call with the technologies. Every time you actually revise or relook at how users or citizens will actually look at technology and use technology, you have to take into consideration, right, all of the other change that is coming around, which is, how do you maintain it? How do you evolve it moving forward? Now, you picked up, I think, a point with European stance on innovation. And I think that Europe does have a lot of innovation happening. In fact, when you look at the innovation scoreboard, which is the European innovation scoreboard, is a metric or a benchmark that shows how countries are actually, innovating and, moving ahead. You're going to see that, the most advanced countries, which are, you start one in the north, right? They have a very different philosophy as to how do they use research to move very fast from fundamental research to applied research to commercialization, so that they can actually take the product over into the market. Cyprus is actually doing quite well. We're actually ranked number 10th, right, in the innovation scoreboard, number 27th in the Global Innovation Index, which means that we're not a laggard, we're not a pioneer, we're somewhere in a very good position, which gives us the confidence to move on, but at the same time, not move at a pace where you move too fast or you move too slow. So let me give you one example for you to understand the danger of where you try to innovate at all cost. Healthcare. We look at pharmaceutical companies that are using data for them to be able to really develop the drugs, But they know inherently that a big part of the statistical number, right? For example, in then using representation of the gender equality is not there. So we have a drug that might be 70% or let's say 75% very efficient at targeting, a remediation or relief from one disease, and we know that 50% of it would be efficient if it's targeting, for example, a lady versus a man. Now, with artificial intelligence, if you start treating every piece of data set equal, right, without removing the bias, without removing all of these other elements that introduce what I would call the distortion in it, right, you create something that may not necessarily be the ideal model for what the end result will be. Now, this is the biggest discussion: is how far do you go by regulating versus not regulating? So Europe actually followed something called a framework for AI, which is a guiding, right, type of a direction and a principle that helps us make sure, right, that when we're going to be building these solutions, we're going to be implicitly protecting, right, a machine by violating fundamental rights that for us, right, are integral in our value belief system. UAE did the same, right? UAE also built, for example, their AI model starting from using a framework. Singapore has done the same. In the US, right, because of a very, very different type of challenge that exists, right? The challenge of the chip maker, building the next technology, bringing this, into technology, into a product. That continuous cycle is somehow different, which dictates somehow the different requirements. And this is where you actually have to start balancing and realizing what makes sense for your ecosystem, for your nation versus somewhere else. And to just give you an example, right? Japan didn't go from their existing car system directly into solar or energy, right? They didn't move 100%, right?
Steps, yes.
Because they really had other alternative options, by a hybrid, fusion, right, that they're working on, or for example, nuclear energy, etc. Now, the companies that are building data centers are also realizing that it's cost inefficient to run a data center just on solar energy and traditional energy sources, and they're actually developing competencies in building nuclear because they want to be able to be autonomous completely, but be able to really have the biggest engineering supercomputers in the world that are going to be fueling, for example, what we call AI, for example, on local. Now, science, right, which Europe is a continent that thrives on science and research and excellence, etc. Right? We have the advent of quantum. Quantum will not be here before the next 5 years, right? We've already seen some productive use cases of it, but the promise of quantum to be there is going to come back, right? In 10 years' time, we're going to be able... It's going to be
huge, though.
It's going to be huge.
And CERN is here as well.
Right? CERN is, right? So CERN is a different chapter, but yes, going from quantum to just conclude...
It uses computer science.
Ultimately, right, these different technology platforms, because what we're talking about right now, will also determine where we are going to be in the future. So can you take a risk as a country to move from today, everything until tomorrow? By the time you get there, you're going to have a next disruptive cycle. Mm-hmm. So you have to go with a phased approach. Our approach is a phased approach. We're actually now moving all of our technology systems slowly right onto a hybrid. We're integrating them. We're making sure that slowly, once we have our cloud first policy, which is due in 2025, we'll be able to have, a hybrid cloud policy and a multi-cloud policy that will enable us to slowly move the older solutions into an area where we can maintain them at lower cost. And as we're doing this, we're also making it much easier, much more user-friendly and efficient for people and citizens of Cyprus to be able to access the service. It takes time. It will go through a continuous cycle until we get the user experience. But this is how these products are continuously evolving. And ultimately, right, it's also a very different way of operating and integrating with people. We need to move from a task-based culture, right, to a service-based culture, towards an experience-based culture. And that's why I said before, it's not just moving because technology. You have to move also slowly. You modernize the process. You make sure that people are reskilled slowly so that you can get there. So these technological leaps, or let's say platforms that we are slowly looking at, open up a very big set of opportunities that I strongly believe are going to create more growth for Cyprus.
What the discussion is coming, it's leading us into a conclusion, is that you have a strategic format, you have a strategic resilience on those elements. You're going from step by step policy. You said you want to have the quality, not solely the quantity. You have it in a stepping milestones, if I can call it that. You have digital milestones, and you're building the evolution phases. I would call it like that. These evolution phases do require robustness and dedication in the strategic dialogue, and I really thank you for clarifying those steps, because this is not really evident all the time in the global markets, what the EU may do or what a single entity within the EU like Cyprus may do vis-a-vis other markets. You mentioned the UAE as well. The UAE has one projective goal vis-a-vis the other markets, is I want to do it today. I don't care about tomorrow, and that's a difference between, let's say, the Europeans, let's say in the UAE, that they want it today, because they feel that this is their way of integrating into the global market community. Unlike, for example, the US, who wants to play a pivotal role, especially with this presidency, in the innovation sector, bringing back the innovation center in the US level vis-a-vis the ones. The Europeans were always more quality based and more stepping stones in integrating and hard making, bringing dialogue and action, if you want, the plan process and the actual planning, as you correctly put, into the next phases of our competence and ours as Europeans. A last question before we end up, because we could go on and on for hours, and we have a lot of sub chapters we could go into. What do you think the vision of technology may be? Is technology bringing us closer in reality with people, or is it driving us apart? We see that technology, or the models of technology, or the tools, or the industry that brings about the creation of a technological artifact, brings us apart. And one of the reasons why we have a lot of wars. So the fight about energy scarcity, the fight about water scarcity, metals, precious raw materials that we need to build any kind of an artifact, from a computer, simple computer, to a mobile phone, to anything that we use in our common day life. Do you think that eventually we can use technology to bring people together in a dialogue for resolution, let's say, of conflicts, if I can call it like this? I'm politicizing a bit the discussion into the world community value, but it is not a coincidence that technology, or cybersecurity for that matter, or AI for that matter, becomes a pillar of security and safety. We spoke about national security, we spoke about infrastructure and so on. Do we actually bring technology into the dialogue, seeking more unity in this ecosystem, I would call it, or World Wide Web, whatever you want to call it?
Thank you. I think the question you just asked has multiple, I think, subparts in it. But let me just start by saying that I strongly believe that technology and science and research unite.
Of course.
Right? And they can unite much more than just unite researchers and institutions across, a country from country to country, but also through continents. And I think Europe, through the framework that was built, Horizon Europe, etc., provided a very good example for us as a reference point to start collaborating and moving forward. However, now we're at a stage where we necessarily should understand that research is one item, technology and innovation and progress, or digital progress, necessarily is another. And to be able to understand that, to be able to start working together and coming together, you also have to understand the value that can be co-created, right, by the joint partnership of two partners, country A, country B, or a multilateral, let's say, number of partners, and at the same time how that can be captured, right? So going back to a question you asked me in the beginning of where did I start, right? Mathematics, history, computer science. I would have never imagined that today I would actually wear a hat of a gentleman who has the role of the chief scientist, which essentially I get to work together with the Deputy Minister of Digital Policy, Research and Innovation with the policy making responsibility, and to be able to really start working on creating that research cooperations, or let's say alliances, that we need to build through MOUs with countries to move forward. But at the same time, also wear the hat of the CTO, who's responsible for seeing the new vision, right, of the nation, and how do we actually glue all of these pieces together, and at the same time work again with the digital, the Deputy Minister of Digital Policy, Research and Innovation. These two parts, right, are very, very fundamentally different. And what's even more important is that the third part, which is the other hat that I wear as a chairman of the AI task force, which is making sure that our national strategy, which will be revised, will be in a position to carry us for the next 5 years up to 2030, requires something fundamentally different, because it requires looking with foresight into the future, predicting how the world will be, in 2030, and making sure that the recommendations here are going to build the building blocks. Now, these three different elements require three different types of partnerships, of unity, of working together. And definitely, right, they have a possibility of reducing conflict, right? And that conflict can actually be materialized in value. And this is where I come back and I say that I have never believed that, there is absolutely tremendous value in focusing on using technology, using innovation, using science, having, of course, though, a common denominator. How do we create value for human mankind, right? And right now, when we look at artificial intelligence, we're faced with so many unknowns. We're faced with so much technology that we need to actually manage for us to be able to use it. But at the same time, right, if we could all put our minds together and come to a point where we could have a virtual human twin for healthcare, right, that would know exactly, that will really know exactly what type of therapy, the success chance you have, what type of drugs, and why something doesn't work on you, so you could have a prescriptive therapy, right, 100% tailored to you, that would be a game changer. And I think these are the elements we as researchers and technologists need to start understanding how to solve them. And we also need to step back and see, do I want to be the technology provider, the solution provider, the manufacturer, and the regulator at the same time? The answer for me personally, right, and I'll speak is indeed, right? Because you don't want to be all of them, but you want to actually be able to influence the process in a way that that regulatory oversight exists, but at the same time, you need to leave each part of it, right, down to the actual experience center that is there. And bringing all of these together, right, for healthcare, for defense, for fintech, for retech, is what we call the digital ecosystem. So we're going to see a world that is going to be advancing very, very fast. Imagine that we're going to be seeing in the future. I mean, I see that when people ask me, how do you envision 2035 or 2040, right?
Well, it depends. Variables, capabilities, people, processes.
It is. But imagine having, for example, government as a service.
Yeah, of course.
Right?
Well, the government is the reason why things are regulated and organized. So you can't do without it. But what makes is a standard. A government standard is the one that puts the pace for the next generation, next development for the public and the private sector, and the one who provides from its own to its own people, the citizen or the resident that visits or remains.
Which brings me to a very important ask from my side. Take some time, jump onto egov.cy, work with our digital citizen, right, the digital assistant, and give us the feedback. How can we change the experience? And I think this is where we need to actually come together as scientists, researchers, technocrats, policymakers, right, and the citizens, to be able to close the loop and to be able to really see how we can actually continue to work on improving policies that are serving the citizens and are also being, used appropriately in a safe manner, armed, I would say, by, all of the technology, the infrastructure that is being built.
To be clear, now that we're closing the discussion and to make it a bit more light, once the digital citizen was there, it was announced, and the very same day I registered everything. and I actually use it. I even did the digital signature. I think I was one of the very, very first people who actually use it, and considering that I understand where this is going. And I think the biggest challenge, we mentioned time, the biggest challenge is to make people aware of the options and to embrace technology. I take it as very simply put. I've always been fascinated by the developments of technology, as you said, healthcare, space, defense, education, all the materials that we now have in our hands and the ones that are developing daily. And I think this is our biggest challenge, how to convince people that technology may be used and it cannot be manipulated. It should be used. And for this and your work and the explanations, I really thank you for giving the time in joining us and explaining to us and telling us also your very, very good work. I have seen your work. I've known your work. I've been observing your work as a professor, as a scientist, you want to call it. And I really thank you. You're very visionary. You're very well put in a very strategic way and very, very qualitative way. And I really thank you. Strategy International is here exactly for this dialogue, even at the level of technology, to make people aware, to raise awareness, to raise dialogue, to help on policy crafting, and even state crafting when things are required. And we look forward to seeing you again, and hopefully to see you again here at Strategy International. So thank you very much, sir.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you all for watching another web series of Prime Analysis here at Strategy International. Please like, share, subscribe, and follow into our social media and YouTube channel. My name is Dr. Marios Efthymiopoulos. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Strategy International. And remember, impact makes a difference.